I held my hand out, steady and open, ready to greet the new CEO as he took his place at the head of the long, polished boardroom table. It was meant to be a simple, professional gesture, nothing more than a quiet acknowledgement of the leadership transition that everyone in the room had gathered to celebrate. The incoming CEO, Ethan Marsh, had just settled into his chair, and the atmosphere was thick with the kind of forced optimism that accompanies these carefully staged corporate events. Cameras were already rolling, 3 of them positioned at different angles, one for the internal company stream, one for external investors watching live, and one for the official archive that no one ever thinks about until something goes catastrophically wrong. The room smelled faintly of fresh white lilies and eucalyptus, the bouquet I had been carrying under my arm as I entered. Someone's assistant had ordered them to soften the space, to make the announcement feel welcoming, almost ceremonial. I stepped forward beside the chairman's chair, extended my hand toward Ethan, and said clearly, "Welcome to Northbridge." Before Ethan could even register the gesture, before his hand could lift even an inch in response, the chairman, Gerald Lang, turned his head sharply toward us. He took in the scene in a single, dismissive sweep. My outstretched hand, the folder tucked under my other arm, the flowers still cradled against my side. His eyes didn't linger on my face. They didn't need to. He had already made his judgment. Then, with a small, practiced scoff that carried perfectly into the lapel microphone clipped to his jacket, he announced to the entire room, and to every live feed, "I don't shake hands with low-level employees." The words landed like a slap, sharp and deliberate. They weren't whispered, they weren't muttered under his breath. They were spoken loudly, confidently, with the casual cruelty of someone who had never once been forced to consider the consequences of his tone. The red lights on the cameras stayed on, unblinking, capturing every second. The reaction rippled through the room almost instantly. A couple of board members near Gerald allowed themselves small, knowing smirks, as if he had just delivered a clever punchline at a private club. Halfway down the table, someone let out a short, nervous laugh, the kind people use when they sense something deeply wrong, but don't want to be the first to call it out. At the back, one of the communication staff tried to hide his grin behind a folder, as though that flimsy barrier could somehow shield him from the lenses pointed directly at the table. Ethan Marsh, the man I had been trying to welcome, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His eyes dropped to the polished wood in front of him rather than meet mine. He didn't reach for my hand. He didn't speak up. He didn't offer even the smallest correction to the chairman's remark. He simply looked away, as if pretending the moment wasn't happening might make it disappear. I didn't withdraw my hand immediately. For a few deliberate seconds, I let it remain there, extended, unshaken, a silent challenge in the midst of the awkward laughter. Gerald's practiced smile faltered just slightly. A flicker of irritation crossed his face, as though my refusal to recoil instantly had disrupted his script. His gaze flicked from my hand to my face, searching, perhaps, for signs that I had misunderstood the hierarchy he had just so publicly declared. The flowers in my arm suddenly felt heavier, as if they had absorbed the weight of the room's discomfort. I kept my voice calm, and even when I finally spoke, "I'm here as instructed," I said. Gerald leaned back in his chair, his contempt barely masked. "Then stand where you're told," he replied coolly. "This meeting is for executives." A muffled awkward escaped from someone near the end of the table, loud enough for neighbors to hear, quiet enough to pretend it hadn't been said at all. Only then did I lower my hand, slowly, deliberately, on my own terms. I placed the bouquet gently on the edge of the table, right in Gerald's line of sight, and walked to the empty seat at the far end of the room. I sat down without waiting for permission. The thin laughter that had briefly filled the air faded into an uneasy silence. Gerald cleared his throat, turned toward the main screen, and announced, "Let's begin." as if the last 2 minutes had been nothing more than a minor distraction. But those 2 minutes had changed everything, and the cameras, with their steady red lights, had seen it all. The silence that followed Gerald's words wasn't the kind that comes from shock alone. It was heavier, more layered, a vacuum created when someone in power draws a line in the sand and expects everyone else to stay on their side. The laughter from the board members had died quickly, leaving behind an uneasy tension that hung in the air like smoke. The cameras continued to roll, their red lights steady and unblinking, recording every second of the unfolding drama for posterity, for investors, for the inevitable clips that would circulate later. I didn't pull my hand back immediately. Instead, I let it linger there, open, steady, unyielding, for a few deliberate seconds. Not out of stubbornness, but out of something more calculated. A refusal to let the moment end on his terms. Gerald's eyes flicked to mine again, searching for the flinch he expected, the retreat that would confirm his authority. When he didn't find it, a faint crease appeared between his brows. His smile, that polished, practiced expression he wore like armor, tightened just enough to betray his annoyance. The bouquet of white lilies and eucalyptus still rested against my side, their clean, floral scent cutting through the sterile boardroom air. I could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, the smirking directors, the nervous executives, Ethan Marsh still staring at the table as if it held the answers to what had just happened. The communications staff member at the back had lowered his folder, but his grin had vanished, replaced by the wide-eyed realization that this wasn't just an awkward moment. It was being broadcast. Slowly, deliberately, I lowered my hand, but I did it on my terms, not his. There was no sudden jerk, no embarrassed retraction. I let my arm drop smoothly, with the same calm control I'd maintained since stepping into the room. Then, without a word, I placed the flowers gently on the edge of the long mahogany table, right where Gerald could not avoid seeing them, a small, elegant reminder of the gesture he had just dismissed. The room watched in silence as I turned and walked the length of the table. My footsteps were soft against the thick carpet, but in the hush that had settled over the group, they might as well have been thunder. I passed the smirking board members, past the executives who suddenly found their agendas fascinating, past Ethan Marsh, who still hadn't lifted his eyes. At the far end of the table, where no nameplate had been set, where no seat had been reserved for me, there was an empty chair. I pulled it out without hesitation and sat down. The sound of the chair sliding into place was the only noise for a long moment. No one spoke. Gerald's posture stiffened, his fingers tightening around the edge of his notes. He had expected me to slink away, to disappear into the background like the low-level employee he had just publicly labeled me. Instead, I had taken a seat at the table, uninvited, unapologetic, and entirely on my own authority. A thin thread of laughter tried to re-emerge from one corner of the room, but it died almost immediately, stretched thin and brittle over the growing discomfort. Someone cleared their throat. Another shifted in their seat. Gerald finally broke the silence, his voice carrying the forced confidence of a man trying to regain control of a room that had already begun to slip away. "Let's begin," he said, turning toward the large screen at the front of the room as if nothing had happened. The first slide appeared, the Northbridge Holdings logo, bold and gleaming, followed by the words, "Leadership Transition and Capital Structure Update." He launched into his prepared remarks, smooth and rehearsed, as though the last few minutes had been a minor technical glitch. But the room knew better. The cameras knew better. And I sat there at the far end of the table, flowers still visible on the polished wood, watching as the first cracks began to form in the carefully constructed narrative they had all come to sell. Gerald had drawn his line. I had crossed it, not by shouting, not by storming out, but by simply refusing to be erased. And that quiet act of defiance had shifted something fundamental in the room. The power dynamic he had so confidently declared was no longer as absolute as he believed. The meeting had only just begun, but the real story was already unfolding. The conference room on the 42nd floor of the glass tower overlooking Manhattan was thick with tension. The air smelled faintly of expensive coffee and the subtle polish of the mahogany table that dominated the space. Lawyers in tailored suits shuffled papers, investment bankers tapped impatiently on their laptops, and the executives from both sides exchanged polite but guarded smiles. The merger talks had dragged on for hours, valuing assets, debating synergies, arguing over earnouts. Everyone was exhausted, but the finish line felt close. Aaron sat at the far end of the table, uncharacteristically quiet throughout most of the negotiation. He was the minority shareholder whose stake had unexpectedly become the swing vote after a last-minute regulatory snag. Without his approval, the entire $12 billion deal would collapse. Yet he had said little, only nodding occasionally or asking brief clarifying questions. Now, as the lead negotiator from the acquiring company, a silver-haired veteran named Richard, extended his hand across the table with a triumphant grin, signaling that they had finally reached an agreement, Aaron did not move to shake it. Instead, he leaned back in his leather chair, his expression calm but unmistakably firm. Richard's hand hung in the air for a moment, the smile faltering. "Aaron, we're good here, right? Everything's signed off on your side." The room fell silent. A few people glanced at one another, unsure what was happening. Aaron's voice cut through the quiet, low and deliberate. "I'm not shaking your hand yet." Richard chuckled awkwardly, lowering his arm. "Come on, we've ironed out every detail. This is the moment we close it." Aaron met his gaze directly, unflinching. "If you're refusing to shake my hand—" He paused, letting the words settle over the room like a sudden chill. "Then by tomorrow morning, $2.5 billion will no longer be part of this deal." A ripple of nervous laughter spread around the table. One of the junior associates snorted, assuming it was a bluff. Richard forced a broader smile, treating it as posturing. $2.5 billion? Aaron, that's a hell of a joke. We're not renegotiating at this stage." But Aaron did not smile back. His eyes remained steady, almost cold. "It's not a joke." The laughter died quickly. People shifted in their seats. Phones were subtly checked under the table. One of the lawyers cleared his throat. "Mr. Aaron, could you clarify what you mean?" He didn't elaborate immediately. Instead, he simply repeated the line, slower this time, as if making sure every person in the room absorbed its weight. "If this deal moves forward without my full commitment, without that handshake, then by sunrise tomorrow, $2.5 billion of the valuation you're counting on will have vanished. Gone. Irretrievable." The room stared at him. No one laughed now. Richard's face had lost its color. Whispers began. Was he serious? Did he have some hidden leverage? A side deal? A regulatory bomb no one knew about? Aaron stood up slowly, buttoning his jacket. "I'll give you until morning to reconsider the terms we discussed privately. After that—" He shrugged, the gesture almost casual. "Well, you'll see." He walked toward the door without another word. The first warning had been delivered, not with shouting or threats, but with a quiet, devastating promise that hung in the air long after he was gone. By the time the sun rose over the East River the next day, everyone in that room would understand that Aaron never bluffed. The morning after the aborted handshake, the same conference room felt different. Sunlight poured in through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but the warmth did nothing to ease the chill that had settled over the group. Richard and his team had arrived early, faces drawn from a sleepless night spent combing through contracts, running scenarios, and making frantic calls to their own board. They still didn't fully understand what leverage Aaron held, but the quiet confidence in his warning had been enough to keep them from walking away. Aaron entered last, alone, carrying only a slim leather folder. He took the same seat at the end of the table, placed the folder in front of him, and waited until the room quieted. Everyone watched him, some with suspicion, others with poorly concealed anxiety. Richard cleared his throat first. Aaron, we've reviewed everything again overnight. We're prepared to discuss whatever adjustments you feel are necessary, but we need clarity. What exactly is the issue? Aaron allowed a small, almost weary smile to cross his face. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, and looked around the room, not at Richard alone, but at every person there, as if making sure they were all paying attention. Before we talk about adjustments, he said evenly, I think it's time you knew who you're actually negotiating with. A few eyebrows rose. One of the younger bankers muttered under his breath, We know who you are. Minority shareholder. Former operating executive at the target company, right? Aaron shook his head slowly. That's what the cap table says. That's what your due diligence binder says. But it isn't the whole story. He opened the folder, though he didn't take anything out. He didn't need to. The gesture was simply to mark the beginning of something. My name is Aaron Price, he began, his voice steady and deliberate. I'm 41 years old, and until 3 weeks ago I was the managing partner of a private capital firm called Pelion Ridge. The words landed like a quiet detonation. Managing partner, not an associate, not a vice president, not some mid-level investor who had been sent to babysit a small legacy position. Managing partner of Pelion Ridge, a name that every person in the room recognized instantly. Pelion Ridge was one of the most discreet, most successful, and most feared private investment firms on the continent. They didn't chase headlines. They didn't need to. Over the past 15 years, they had quietly built a reputation for turning around distressed assets, extracting extraordinary returns, and, when necessary, waging brutal proxy fights or leveraged buyouts that left competitors reeling. Richard's mouth actually opened for a second before he caught himself. Pelion Ridge? You're the Aaron Price. Aaron gave a small nod. The same. A ripple of murmured conversation broke out. Phones were pulled out again, this time openly, as people frantically searched for confirmation. Within seconds, someone found the old press release from 6 years earlier announcing Aaron's promotion to managing partner. Another pulled up a grainy photo from a closed-door industry conference where Aaron had been the keynote speaker. There he was, younger, perhaps, but unmistakable. But the shareholder list, Richard stammered, it shows you personally, not Pelion Ridge. That's correct, Aaron replied. 3 weeks ago, I stepped down from Pelion Ridge. The separation was sudden. The stake you see in my name was part of my carried interest allocation from a fund we closed 8 years ago. When I left, I kept it personally. Everything else stayed with the firm. He paused, letting that sink in. So, yes, he continued, on paper I'm just a minority holder with a blocking position. But the knowledge, the relationships, and the resources I built over 15 years at Pelion Ridge didn't walk out the door with me. And neither did my understanding of exactly how much this company is worth, and how much certain people in this room are trying to underpay for it. The room was silent now. No nervous laughter, no skeptical glances. Only the hum of the city far below. Aaron leaned back again, folding his hands. This story doesn't begin yesterday in this conference room, he said quietly. It begins 3 weeks ago on a rainy afternoon in Pelion Ridge's offices in Greenwich. When I was called into a partner meeting I didn't know would change everything. To understand why I'm sitting here willing to let $2.5 billion evaporate overnight, you need to understand what happened that day, and everything that led up to it. He closed the leather folder with a soft snap. So let me take you back to the beginning. Aaron paused for a moment, letting the revelation from the previous day settle. The room was quieter now, the skepticism replaced by a wary respect. He didn't rush. He knew that to make them understand why he was willing to torpedo a multi-billion-dollar deal overnight, they needed to see where he had come from, not just the polished resume, but the scars beneath it. He leaned forward again, his voice dropping into the measured cadence of someone recounting a story he had lived 1,000 times in his own mind. "I didn't start out dreaming of private equity," he began. "Like a lot of people in this room, I went to a good school, got good grades, and landed a job in corporate finance at a Fortune 500 manufacturing company, straight out of my MBA. I was 26, ambitious, and convinced I was going to climb the ladder fast." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried no joy. The company made industrial equipment, heavy machinery, the kind that keeps factories running. Solid business, strong balance sheet, loyal customers. On paper, everything looked stable, but inside the executive floor was a different story. Aaron's eyes drifted toward the window, as if watching memories play out against the skyline. The CEO was a charismatic guy, tall, silver-tongued, always on the cover of some industry magazine. He believed his own press. The board loved him because revenue was growing, mostly through acquisitions. Every year we bought another company, loaded it with debt, slashed costs, and dressed up the numbers for Wall Street. Synergies, they called it. I called it something else. He turned back to the room. I was in the corporate development group. My job was to run the models, structure the debt, make the acquisitions look brilliant. I watched good companies, family-owned businesses with proud employees, get gutted. Plants closed, pensions frozen, R&D budgets zeroed out. Also, the stock could pop another 5%, and the C-suite could cash in their options. A few people shifted uncomfortably. They knew this story. Some had probably written chapters of it themselves. Then came the big one, Aaron continued, a leveraged buyout of our largest competitor. The deal was celebrated like a Super Bowl win, champagne in the boardroom, press releases everywhere. But the numbers never worked. We overpaid by at least 30%, financed it with junk bonds, and assumed growth would bail us out. When the economy slowed, the debt became a noose. Within 3 years, the company filed for bankruptcy. Thousands lost jobs, retirees lost savings, suppliers went unpaid, and the executives, they walked away with golden parachutes worth tens of millions. He let the silence stretch. I was 31 when it all collapsed. I had a front-row seat to how arrogance and greed could destroy something that had taken generations to build. I watched leaders who thought they were invincible ruin lives because they refused to admit they might be wrong. And I promised myself 2 things. First, I would never again work for people like that. Second, if I ever controlled capital, I would never be reckless with other people's money. Aaron's tone softened, but his gaze remained sharp. That's when I left corporate life. I spent a few years at a mid-sized private equity shop, learning the craft properly. Turnarounds, operational improvements, patient capital. I saw what good investors could do: save companies, grow them responsibly, create real value. But I also saw the other side, firms that treated businesses like poker chips, loading them with debt and flipping them before the cracks showed. He paused, folding his hands. In 2011, at 35, I co-founded Pelion Ridge with 2 partners who shared the same scars. We started small. One fund, $400 million, all from family offices and endowments that trusted us to be careful. Our pitch was simple. We would only invest in situations we understood deeply. We would never over-leverage, and we would treat every dollar, ours or our LPs, like it was our own last dollar. He looked around the table, making eye contact with Richard and the others. Our guiding principle was blunt. Don't be stupid with other people's money. That meant no ego-driven deals, no paying stupid prices just to get a logo on the website, no betting the farm on macroeconomic fairy tales. It meant saying no far more often than yes. And when we did invest, we rolled up our sleeves and fixed what was broken: operations, culture, strategy, before we ever thought about an exit. Aaron leaned back slightly. Over 15 years, we built Pelion Ridge into something I was proud of. 8 funds, consistent top quartile returns, a reputation for being tough but fair. We saved companies others had written off. We never lost an LP a dime. And through it all, I kept coming back to one truth I learned watching that bankruptcy unfold. He let the moment breathe, then spoke the line quietly, but with absolute conviction. Money doesn't change people. It just makes it easier to see who they already were. The words hung in the air. No one interrupted. No phones buzzed. For the first time since the negotiations began, the room wasn't thinking about the deal in front of them. They were thinking about the man across the table, and what kind of person he had become because of the things he had seen. Aaron exhaled slowly. That's the journey that brought me here, a career built on watching arrogance destroy value and vowing never to let it happen on my watch. Which brings us to this deal, and why I'm not willing to shake hands on terms that repeat the same mistakes I've spent my life trying to prevent. Aaron let the weight of his last words linger for a moment before continuing. The room had changed in subtle ways. No one was checking emails anymore. No one was whispering side conversations. They were all listening, really listening, to a story that was starting to feel less like background and more like the explanation for everything that was happening now. He straightened slightly in his chair and went on. Fast forward to 2018, Pelion Ridge was on our 4th fund, about $2.8 billion under management, still small by mega fund standards. But we liked it that way. We could move quickly, think independently, and stay true to our principles. That year, we were introduced to a company called Northbridge Holdings. He glanced around the table, noting the flicker of recognition on a few faces. Northbridge was a diversified industrial conglomerate: pipelines, logistics, specialty chemicals, some energy services exposure. Old line business founded in the 1950s, still controlled by the founding family's descendants. Revenues around $9 billion, decent margins, but carrying too much debt from a string of poorly timed acquisitions. The family wanted liquidity, the banks were getting nervous, and management was, let's say, entrenched. Classic setup for us. Aaron's tone remained even, almost clinical. But there was an undercurrent of remembered intensity. We spent 9 months on due diligence, deep operational work, channel checks, customer interviews, forensic accounting. The full treatment. What we found was a company that could be great again if someone forced discipline on capital allocation and replaced a few legacy executives who treated the balance sheet like a personal ATM. The numbers worked at the right price, so we structured a deal. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. Pelion Ridge led a consortium that committed $2.5 billion in new equity, preferred stock with some governance rights. In exchange, we got board seats, veto rights on major decisions, and a clear path to a majority position over time if things went well. The family rolled most of their shares, management got new incentives aligned with us, and the banks refinanced on better terms. On paper, everyone won. Richard shifted in his seat. He knew where this was going. Northbridge had become a case study in certain circles. But we had learned the hard way that paper protections aren't enough, Aaron continued. I'd seen too many boards asleep at the wheel while CEOs flew private jets to golf tournaments during bankruptcy hearings. I'd watched independent directors rubber stamp reckless deals because they didn't want to rock the boat. So we insisted on something unusual, something the lawyers on the other side hated from the moment they saw it. He allowed himself a faint, wry smile. We called it politely the conduct integrity provision. It was buried in the investment agreement, Schedule 7.3c, if any of you want to look it up later. In plain English, it said that if any member of senior management, or any board member for that matter, engaged in conduct that materially damaged the reputation or long-term value of the company, Pelion Ridge could withdraw its capital commitment immediately. Not pro rata, not over time, immediately. Full redemption at par plus accrued dividends, no questions asked, no cure period. A couple of the lawyers across the table exchanged glances. They knew exactly how toxic that kind of clause was to management teams. It was a sword hanging over every decision, every public appearance, every expense report. Their general counsel fought it tooth and nail, Aaron said, called it a reputational escape hatch, and accused us of lacking confidence in the team. I told him the opposite was true. We had confidence in the business, but not in human nature when large amounts of money remove consequences. We weren't going to let our LP's capital be hostage to someone's ego or indiscretion. He shrugged lightly. They eventually signed. They needed the money, and no one else was offering a check that size without even more draconian terms. Closing day was a Friday in October 2018. Champagne, handshakes, the usual theater. Everyone smiled for the press release. Aaron's expression darkened almost imperceptibly. 18 months later, the CEO, still the same one who had negotiated with us, was caught in a scandal. Nothing criminal, thank God, but bad enough. An extramarital affair with a senior executive at one of our largest customers, expense account abuse on a scale that made headlines, and leaked emails showing he'd pressured subordinates to cook channel stuffing numbers to hit his bonus targets. The stock dropped 20% in a week. Customers started reviewing contracts. Regulators opened inquiries. He looked directly at Richard. We didn't hesitate. On a Monday morning, our counsel delivered the redemption notice under the conduct integrity provision. By Wednesday, $2.5 billion, plus accrued, had been wired back to us. The company scrambled to refinance, took on high-yield debt at punitive rates, and eventually sold itself piecemeal at a fraction of what it had been worth. The family lost control. Management was cleaned out. And Pelion Ridge? We returned capital to our investors intact, plus a small preferred return. No loss, no drama. The room was utterly still. That clause, Aaron said quietly, saved our limited partners from a slow-motion disaster. It proved that sometimes the most valuable protection isn't financial engineering. It's the ability to walk away when you see who people really are under pressure. He let the silence hold for a beat. So when I told you yesterday that $2.5 billion could disappear by morning, I wasn't bluffing. I've done it before. And I structured my personal investment in this company with a very similar provision, one you apparently missed in the footnotes. Aaron closed the leather folder again, the soft snap echoing in the quiet room. Now you understand why I'm not afraid to let value walk out the door if the people on the other side won't meet the standards I've spent 20 years enforcing. The question is, are you willing to give me the same protection I've always demanded, or do you want to find out what happens when I pull the trigger again? Aaron allowed a longer pause this time, as if weighing how much more of himself he was willing to expose. The conference room had grown almost uncomfortably quiet. Even the distant hum of midtown traffic seemed muted. Everyone waited. They knew by now that whatever came next would not be filler. It would be another piece of the puzzle explaining why a man with his reputation was sitting here, alone, holding a multi-billion-dollar deal hostage. He exhaled slowly and resumed. You're probably wondering why the managing partner of Pelion Ridge, someone who could have sent a team of vice presidents, analysts, and lawyers, showed up in person for the final negotiation sessions of this merger, especially for what looked like a minority blocking position. Most people in my seat would delegate, attend by video, if at all, sign the documents remotely and move on. He glanced at Richard, then at the rest of the acquiring team. I didn't. A faint, rueful smile touched his lips. After Northbridge, after pulling that $2.5 billion redemption and watching the fallout, I made a new rule for myself. Whenever a deal reached the stage where handshakes were about to happen, where reputations, careers, and billions rested on mutual trust, I would be in the room, not on a screen, not represented by subordinates. Me. In person. He leaned forward, voice lowering. Because paper is cheap. NDAs, representations and warranties, governance rights, they all look ironclad until someone decides to ignore them. But people reveal themselves in small moments. The way they treat the waiter who brings coffee, how quickly they interrupt a junior colleague, whether they look you in the eye when they promise something. I've learned that those fleeting signals tell you more about long-term risk than any diligence memo ever could. Richard shifted again, sensing the direction this was heading. That's why I flew in 2 days ago, Aaron continued. No entourage, no advance team to announce me, just me and a carry-on. I wanted to watch, to listen, to see who you all really were when you thought the deal was already done and the only thing left was theater. He spread his hands slightly, the gesture almost apologetic. And that's where the misunderstanding began. A couple of people frowned, unsure what he meant. Aaron's tone turned drier. When I arrived at your lobby yesterday morning for the first full session, the receptionist was flustered. Your team hadn't shared the final attendee list with security, or with her. Northbridge's side, my side technically, hadn't bothered to update anyone either. They still thought of me as the quiet minority holder who would rubber stamp whatever was put in front of him. No one expected the former head of Pelion Ridge to walk in unannounced. He shook his head, the memory clearly still irritating him. I gave my name. She searched the system, couldn't find it, and called upstairs. Someone on your coordination team, harried, late for the setup, said, "Oh, just send him up with the flowers." Apparently, the floral arrangements for the closing table had arrived at the same time, and the regular delivery guy had called in sick. Quiet chuckles escaped despite the tension. A few people looked mortified. So there I was, Aaron went on. Aaron Price, 41 years old, ex-managing partner of a firm that once controlled almost $10 billion in assets, standing in the lobby holding 2 enormous bouquets of white orchids and lilies because the receptionist didn't know what else to do with me. He let the image settle. When the elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor, one of your associates grabbed the flowers from my hands, muttered a quick, "Thanks, man," and pointed me toward the credenza where the coffee station was being set up. No name tent on the table for me because no one had prepared one. No introduction. Just assumptions. His voice hardened slightly. They saw flowers in my hand, no nameplate, no entourage, and they decided what I was. Support staff, a prop, someone to fetch water pitchers or replace marker pens when they ran dry. He looked slowly around the table, meeting eyes one by one. That single moment told me everything I needed to know about how decisions are made in this building. Not by the models or the synergies you spent weeks presenting, but by snap judgments, by who gets seen and who gets overlooked, by who is treated as an equal and who is dismissed before they even speak. The room was deathly quiet now. I could have corrected them right then, Aaron admitted. Flashed a business card, made a call, demanded the respect my title usually commands. But I didn't. I stayed quiet. I carried the extra water bottles when asked. I even refilled the coffee urn once, because I wanted to see how far the blindness went. And it went all the way to the moment Richard extended his hand yesterday, smiling like the deal was sealed, without ever once wondering why the delivery guy from the morning was now sitting at the end of the table with a blocking vote. He leaned back, the faintest trace of satisfaction in his expression. That's the real reason I wouldn't shake your hand. Not just the commercial terms, though those are bad enough, but because in the span of 24 hours, I watched a room full of supposedly sophisticated people demonstrate the exact kind of casual arrogance I've spent my career guarding against, the kind that assumes it already knows who matters and who doesn't. Aaron folded his hands again. So yes, I'm the minority shareholder on paper, but I'm also the man who once walked out of a $2.5 billion commitment because leadership revealed who they really were, and I'm not willing to entrust my stake, my reputation, my principles, to people who couldn't even recognize me when I stood right in front of them holding flowers. He let the silence stretch one last time. Now you know why I'm here in person, and why your first impression of me might be the last one you get if we can't fix what it revealed. The afternoon session resumed after a brief recess, but the atmosphere had shifted subtly. Aaron returned to his seat at the end of the table, still without a proper name tent, still treated as an afterthought. The acquiring team's lawyers distributed fresh markup pages, and Richard launched into a confident summary of the final terms, as if the previous day's warning had been nothing more than theatrical posturing. Conversation flowed around Aaron rather than to him. When coffee was poured, no one offered him a cup until he reached for the carafe himself. When a junior associate needed a pen, she wordlessly took one from the small stack in front of him. He remained calm, almost detached, observing every small slight the way a naturalist watches animals in the wild. Then came the moment that changed everything. Richard turned to the financing section of the agenda. "We're comfortable with the debt package," he said smoothly. "The banks are fully committed, and the equity bridge from Pelion Ridge's old co-investment vehicle is locked in. Paul, you've confirmed the signature pages on that, correct?" Paul Graves, the CFO of the target company, Northbridge's former portfolio company and now the merger target, nodded absently while scrolling through his tablet. He was a meticulous man in his mid-50s, graying at the temples, known for triple-checking every commitment letter. "Yes, the $2.5 billion preferred equity piece is signed and irrevocable. The authorizing signatory executed last week. We're covered." Richard smiled. "Good. Then we're ready to move to closing mechanics." Paul frowned suddenly, his thumb freezing mid-scroll. He tapped the screen twice, zooming in on a signature block. His face paled. "Hold on," he muttered. Then louder. "Hold on." The room quieted. Paul looked up, eyes scanning the table until they landed on Aaron. Recognition flickered, then widened into shock. "Mr. Price?" he asked, voice uncertain. "Aaron Price?" Aaron inclined his head slightly. "That would be me." Paul swallowed. "You're the authorizing signatory on the commitment?" "That would be me," Aaron said again, his tone even. Paul's gaze darted back to the tablet, then to Aaron, then to Richard. "All of it? The entire $2.5 billion tranche?" "All of it," Aaron said. "Without it, the remaining commitments can't proceed. The bank's facility is conditioned on that equity layer being fully funded first." A stunned silence fell. Richard laughed nervously. "Wait, what?" "Paul, you said the signature was in. You showed me the executed pages." Paul's voice cracked slightly. "I did. But I assumed it was one of Pelion Ridge's execution partners. The signature just says, 'Aaron Price, authorized signatory.' I didn't. No one told me it was him." He gestured weakly toward Aaron. Head swiveled, eyes widened. The junior associate, who had taken Aaron's pen earlier, flushed crimson. The lawyer, who had asked him to move his water glass so she could spread out documents, now stared as if seeing him for the first time. Richard recovered first, forcing composure. "Aaron, if this is about additional protections or pricing—" "It isn't about pricing anymore," Aaron interrupted quietly. "It's about whether I'm willing to fund alongside people who spent 2 days treating me like hired help." The panic spread visibly. Phones emerged from pockets. Urgent whispers began. Someone muttered, "Get legal on the line, now." Aaron simply sat back and watched the realization sink in. The quiet man they had ignored, the one carrying flowers and refilling coffee, held unilateral authority over a quarter of the entire capital structure, and he had just warned them, twice, that he was prepared to walk away. The session broke for a 15-minute recess while both sides consulted internally. Aaron stepped out onto the small balcony overlooking the avenue 42 floors below. The January wind was sharp, but he welcomed it. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number from memory. His former partner, Elena Marquez, now the acting managing partner of Pelion Ridge, answered on the second ring. "Aaron, tell me you're not doing what I think you're doing." "I am," he said calmly. "Activate the withdrawal. All of it." A pause. "You're sure?" "Completely. Reason code, conduct during negotiations, material impairment of trust and reputational alignment." Elena exhaled. "I'll have counsel draft the notice immediately. It'll hit their inboxes within the hour. Redemption at par plus accrued, wired by close of business tomorrow." "Thank you." He ended the call and stood there a moment longer, watching taxis crawl along the street far below. Then he went back inside. When the group reconvened, the mood was frantic. Richard was mid-sentence, offering enhanced governance rights, a higher fee, anything to keep the capital in place. Aaron raised a hand gently. "You don't need to negotiate anymore." He placed a printed email on the table, the formal redemption notice, time-stamped 3 minutes earlier. Effective immediately. The $2.5 billion commitment is withdrawn pursuant to Section 7.3c, the Conduct Integrity Provision. Funds will be returned to investors intact. The deal, as currently structured, no longer has sufficient equity to close. Richard stared at the page as if it were written in another language. "You can't. This is blackmail." "It's enforcement of a clause you all signed," Aaron replied. "One I insisted on for exactly this reason." Within minutes the news leaked, first to traders monitoring regulatory filings, then to journalists with sources in the banks. The target company's stock, which had been trading up on merger arbitrage, began to slide. 5%, 10, 15. Circuit breakers paused, trading twice in the final hour. By the time the closing bell rang, more than $4 billion in market value had evaporated. Not just the withdrawn equity, but the contagion of doubt now attached to the entire transaction. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was swift and merciless. The board suspended Chairman Gerald Harrington pending an internal investigation into leadership judgment and culture. The much-celebrated incoming CEO, whose appointment had been announced with fanfare only days earlier, was quietly placed on administrative leave. The search restarted from scratch. The merger collapsed entirely. The banks pulled their debt commitments when the equity hole could not be filled. The company entered a prolonged period of uncertainty: credit downgrades, customer defections, talent flight. Richard called Aaron repeatedly, then emailed, then sent intermediaries. Offers escalated, board seats, higher valuations, personal apologies. Aaron declined everyone. He had no interest in revenge, only in consequence. In the end, the company was sold piecemeal to a consortium of distressed investors at a steep discount. The proud industrial name that had survived decades was broken apart. Months later, at an industry conference, someone asked Aaron whether the destruction had been worth it. He thought for a moment before answering. On the morning of the final session, he said, I held my hand out to greet a new CEO. The chairman decided that was beneath him. He walked past me to shake hands with people he considered more important. Aaron paused, letting the room absorb it. Turned out it was priced at $2.5 billion. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. The message was clear, and it echoed far beyond that conference room. Power without respect is fragile. Capital without accountability is fleeting. And the quiet person you overlook today may be the one who decides tomorrow whether your empire stands or falls. Some lessons are expensive. This one cost exactly $2.5 billion, and it was worth every cent.